Hi there, I'm Cal, and welcome to the WHMIS 2015 training course. I'm here to help you understand how the system works so you can safely handle hazardous products and chemicals at work. In this course, you'll learn about the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, GHS, or WHMIS 2015. This training will give you the knowledge to understand WHMIS, how it applies to you, describe the hazard groups, classes, and categories, as well as pictograms, labels, and SDS sheets. Let's get started. Let's look at our course outline. This course is divided into 7 modules, with pauses after each module so you can answer a few review questions. Module 1, Changes to WHMIS and the Law. Module 2, Responsibilities under WHMIS. Module 3, Classification. Module 4, Communication. Module 5, Worker Training. Module 6, SDS Sheets. And Module 7, WHMIS Training. Module 1, Changes to WHMIS and the Law. There are 4 important questions to keep in mind as we go through this training. These questions are the first questions you should ask yourself when dealing with hazardous products. What are the hazards? How do I protect myself? What do I do if there's an incident with a hazardous product? How do I get more information? This is the information that you need to know as the worker to protect yourself and others from hazardous materials. In 2015, WHMIS was updated to incorporate the Globally Harmonized System of Classification, or GHS, so all countries around the world would utilize a single international system for chemical classification and labeling. The purpose of this was to create a globally uniform and consistent hazard identification, classification, and language. The consistent labeling provides workers with the information they need to protect themselves when working around hazardous material. All employees that use hazardous products have a legal obligation to make sure that employees using or working near those hazardous products are WHMIS trained. WHMIS 2015 is the result of the adoption of the Globally Harmonized System, or GHS. GHS enables Canada to use the same United Nations standards of classifying hazardous products and communicating those associated hazards. In Canada, GHS does not replace WHMIS, but instead aligns Canada with GHS elements. The GHS alignment began in early 2015, allowing manufacturers, importers, distributors, and employers a transition period with a completion date of December 1st, 2018. What does WHMIS stand for? WHMIS is an acronym that stands for Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System. WHMIS is a Canada-wide system to provide employers and workers with information about the hazardous products in the workplace. WHMIS falls under both provincial and federal regulations in Canada. WHMIS is governed under provincial and federal laws. Each province has their own laws and regulations. WHMIS is covered federally under many pieces of legislation, including the Hazardous Products Regulation, or HPR. Your understanding of WHMIS and participation in training falls under your 3 fundamental rights as an employee. 1. The right to know. 2. The right to participate. 3. The obligation to refuse unsafe work. Why WHMIS, you ask? Chemicals directly and indirectly affect our lives and are essential to our food, health, and lifestyles. The widespread use of chemicals for so many purposes has resulted in the development of specific regulations for areas like workplace, transportation, production, trade, and consumer products. The hazardous properties of chemicals and their control measures must be readily available to ensure the production, transport, use, and disposal of chemicals to be safely managed. WHMIS helps us to address the following concerns. 1. What do we do with unlabeled chemicals in the workplace? 2. How do we ensure awareness by employers and workers about the hazards of the chemicals they're using? 3. Is adequate information given by suppliers to employers using their products? And 4. How do we make sure consistent information is available between jurisdictions? The benefits of aligning WHMIS with GHS include consistent hazard identification, classification, and language, safe transportation, handling, and use of hazardous products, more effective emergency response planning, increased efficiency and reduction in cost, providing consistency for hazard communication. Before GHS, a product that might be toxic under WHMIS in Canada might have been labeled differently elsewhere. For example, it could be labeled harmful in Europe and Australia, moderately toxic in China, hazardous in New Zealand, or non-toxic in India. As you can see, consistency is a great advantage of using GHS worldwide. There are some exclusions from WHMIS. Most products are covered under WHMIS regulations, although some products are not. Products that are exempt from WHMIS 2015 but are covered under other legislation include explosives, which are covered under the Explosives Act, pesticides, which are covered under the Pest Control Products Act, nuclear substances, which are covered under the Hazardous Product Regulations and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or CNSC, wood and wood products, consumer products, which are also covered under the Hazardous Products Regulation, products under the TDG or Transportation of Dangerous Good Regulations, and hazardous waste. Some of the more noticeable changes to WHMIS 2015 include some verbiage changes. Controlled products will instead be called hazardous products, and material safety data sheets, or MSDSs, are instead called safety data sheets, or SDSs. They're different in new hazard classes with each classification criteria. There's new supplier labels and new pictograms. Safety data sheets, or SDSs, have 16 sections, and the requirement to update every 3 years has been removed. Some things have not changed. This includes workers still receive training and education in WHMIS, the requirement for supplier and workplace labels, and safety data sheets, or SDSs, must always be readily available to workers. Let's pause for our first review to see what we've learned so far. Module 2. Responsibilities under WHMIS. WHMIS 2015 is a 3-part system with criteria under each part. We'll go into more detail on this later on. Each part of the WHMIS system has its own unique components. Right now, let's take a look at our responsibilities under WHMIS 2015. Under Part 1 Classification, only the supplier has responsibilities here. Under the classification of hazardous products, the supplier responsibilities are to identify the relevant hazard data for the products and to ensure the products are classified appropriately. Responsibilities under Part 2. Communication. The supplier has responsibilities for safety data sheets. The supplier must develop or obtain a safety data sheet for each hazardous product imported or sold for use in the workplace. They must provide a copy to the purchaser on or before the date of sale, make safety data sheets available in both English and French, and ensure that the content is current. The employer also has responsibilities for safety data sheets. The employer must ensure a copy of the safety data sheet is obtained on or before the receipt of the hazardous product. A copy of the safety data sheet is available at the worksite before workers use the hazardous product. Workers must know where the safety data sheets are kept and understand both the information and its significance. The employer must also update the safety data sheet within 90 days of new information coming out about the product. Workers have a responsibility to become familiar with the applicable safety data sheet before using the hazardous product. We'll explain why as we go through this course. Suppliers have responsibility for labeling. They must apply labels to the container of a hazardous product before it is sold, and supply labels with bulk shipments for application upon arrival at a destination. and revise the label and apply it to all future sales of the hazardous product if new information becomes available. Employers have responsibilities for labels as well. They must ensure all containers of hazardous products at the workplace are labeled. They must apply supplier labels to the inner containers of multi-container shipments. Ensure that workers understand the information on the label and are aware of the need to review the applicable safety data sheet. They must also create and apply workplace labels as required. They must advise workers as to the relevance of other means of labeling, such as color coding and placards, and ensure that no person removes, alters, or defaces a label. Workers have a few responsibilities for labels too. You must read the labels prior to using hazardous products. Follow your employer's direction to avoid removing, altering, or defacing a label, and report to your supervisor any labels that require replacement. Always ask questions if you do not understand the information on the label. Part 3. Worker training outlines the following training responsibilities. Employers have a responsibility too. Provide information on the use, care, and safe handling of hazardous products to the worker, as well as the purpose and significance of the safety data sheets. They must provide training for the safe use, storage, handling, and disposal of hazardous products, and ensure training in emergency procedures for the hazardous product. Workers have responsibilities too. Cooperate with the employer by learning the information on both labels and the safety data sheet, and also to advise your employer if you don't understand the information on the hazardous product, or if the information is insufficient for you to work safely. Let's pause for review here to answer a few questions. Module 3. Classification. Let's take a look at the first part of WHMIS 2015, Part 1, Classification. Here, we're going to break down the hazard groups, classes, and categories. Classification is the determination of whether or not a product meets the criteria for inclusion in any of the WHMIS classes and is therefore subject to WHMIS information requirements. WHMIS 2015 utilizes the GHS standards and criteria based on the United Nations Dangerous Goods System to classify hazardous products. Hazardous products are classified using a complex system based on various forms of data. The classification of health and environmental hazards uses a layered approach dependent on information available for the mixture and/or the chemical components of the substances. All hazardous products are classified into the following components: hazard groups, hazard classes, and hazard categories. Let's take a look at the hazard groups. WHMIS hazard groups are made up of 3 elements. The first is physical hazards. These are based on the physical or chemical properties of a product, for example, flammability, reactivity, or corrosivity to metals. Next, we have the hazards, which are based on the ability of the product to cause a health effect, for example, eye irritation, respiratory sensitization, which means the product may cause an allergy, asthma, or breathing difficulties if inhaled, or carcinogenity, meaning it may cause cancer. And lastly, environmental hazards. Is it hazardous to the aquatic environment, acute or chronic? And is it hazardous to the ozone layer? Let's take a closer look. Hazard classes are defined under each of the 3 hazard groups. Each category of the hazard groups we talked about has a hazard class with unique hazard properties. It's not unusual for a hazard product to belong to more than one hazard group, meaning the product can cause a risk in multiple ways. There are 19 physical classes, 12 health classes, and 2 environmental classes. There are 19 physical hazard classes. These include the following: 1. Flammable gases. 2. Flammable aerosols. 3. Oxidizing gases. 4. Gases under pressure. 5. Flammable liquids. 6. Flammable solids. 7. Self-reactive substances and mixtures. 8. Pyrophoric liquids. 9. Pyrophoric solids. 10. Self-heating substances and mixtures. 11. Substances and mixtures which in contact with water emit flammable gas. 12. Oxidizing liquids. 13. Oxidizing solids. 14. Oxidizing peroxides. 15. Corrosive to metals. 16. Combustible dusts. 17. Simple asphyxiates. 18. Pyrophoric gases. And 19. Physical hazards not otherwise classified. The 12 health classes include the following. 1. Acute toxicity. 2. Skin corrosion or irritation. 3. Serious eye damage or eye irritation. 4. Respiratory or skin sensitization. 5. Germ cell mutagenicity. 6. Carcinogenicity. 7. Reproductive toxicity. 8. Specific target organ toxicity or STOT, single exposure. 9. Specific target organ toxicity or STOT for repeated exposure. 10. Aspiration hazard. 11. Biohazardous infectious. 12. Health hazards not otherwise classified. And lastly, there are only 2 environmental classes: hazardous to the aquatic environment or hazardous to the ozone layer. Diesel fuel is a good example to look at the hazard groups and classes, as this is a hazardous product that contains hazards for all 3 hazard groups: physical, health, and environmental. Physical: flammable liquid. Health: aspiration hazard. Carcinogenicity, STOT single exposure, STOT repeated exposure, and skin-eye irritation. Environmental: chronic aquatic toxicity. The final component under Part 1, the classification of WHMIS, is hazard categories. The hazard category tells you how hazardous the product is by identifying the severity of the hazard with a number. The hazard categories are assigned a number between 1 and 5, with 1 being the most hazardous and 5 being the least hazardous. Seeing a lower number in the hazard category should tell you to make sure you get as much information about the product before you use it. The categories can be classified into subcategories. Subcategories are identified with the category number and a letter A being more serious than B. This is to further break down the risk of using the product. A 1A rating would have more risk than a 1B, but still be more serious than a hazard category of 2. We'll use diesel fuel as our example once again. Here we can see the 3 hazard groups and the classes diesel fuel belongs to, as well as the hazard category or severity level. We can tell that diesel fuel has a serious aspiration hazard under the health hazard category and is listed as a category 1. But we can also see that the skin and eye irritation has a hazard subcategory. This is because while diesel fuel can be harmful to your skin and eyes, it does not meet the severity of a solid category 2 ranking, but is still more serious than a category 3. Therefore, it's listed as 2B. Let's pause for another review and recap what we've learned from this module. Module 4. Communication. Remember that WHMIS has 3 parts? So let's now look at the second part, communication. WHMIS communication is broken down into 6 parts: pictograms, signal words, hazard statements, precautionary statements, labels, and SDSs, safety data sheets. WHMIS 2015 has standardized hazard communication, so there's a clear understanding of the hazards of products used in the workplace. GHS has established the following guiding principles for hazard communication. Hazard communication must be available in more than one form. For example, pictograms, labels, and SDSs. It must include both hazard statements and precautionary statements, and it must be easy to understand, standard, and consistent to reduce confusion. First, we'll take a look at pictograms. Several new pictograms exist with WHMIS 2015 global harmonization. The dangerously reactive compounds pictogram, seen in WHMIS 1988, no longer exists in WHMIS 2015. All pictograms are now red diamonds to align with TDG placard symbols. The only exception is the biohazard pictogram, which will remain the same. Pictograms are used to represent hazards. Hazard classes and categories are assigned to a pictogram. The flame pictogram is used for the following classes and categories: flammable gases, aerosols, liquids and solids, pyrophoric liquids, solids and gases, as well as self-heating substances and mixtures, and those that emit flammable gases when they come into contact with water. Self-reactive substances and mixtures and organic peroxides are also listed here. The flame over a circle pictogram is used to identify oxidizing gases, liquids, and solids. The gas cylinder pictogram is used for gases under pressure: compressed gas, liquefied gas, refrigerated liquefied gas, and dissolved gas. The corrosion pictogram is used for hazardous products that are corrosive to metals, skin, and can cause serious eye damage and irritation. The exploding bomb pictogram is new and is used for self-reactive substances and certain types of organic peroxides. The skull and crossbones pictogram is used for hazardous products that cause acute toxicity: oral, Category 1, 2, and 3, dermal, Category 1, 2, and 3, and inhalation, Category 1, 2, and 3. The health hazard pictogram is also new and is used for hazardous products with specific health hazards that have a higher severity: respiratory or skin sensitization, respiratory sensitizer, Category 1, 1A, and 1B. Germ cell mutagenicity, Category 1, 1A, 1B, and 2. Carcinogenicity, Category 1, 1A, 1B, and 2. Reproductive toxicity, Category 1, 1A, 1B, and 2. Specific target organ toxicity, single exposure, Category 1 and 2. Specific target organ toxicity, repeated exposure, Category 1 and 2. Aspiration hazard, Category 1. The exclamation pictogram is to identify various categories of health hazards within a lesser severity: acute toxicity, oral, dermal, inhalation, Category 4. Skin corrosion or irritation, skin irritation, Category 2. Serious eye damage or eye irritation, Category 2 and 2A. Respiratory or skin sensitization, skin sensitizer, Category 1, 1A, and 1B. Specific target organ toxicity, single exposure, Category 3. The biohazardous and infectious materials pictogram remains the same. Biohazardous infectious materials, Category 1. Note: physical hazards not otherwise classified and health hazards not otherwise classified are required to have a GHS pictogram that is appropriate to the hazard identified. And the last new pictogram added into WHMIS 2015 is the environmental pictogram, which includes hazards to the aquatic environment. Let's pause here for another review. Module 5: Signal words, precautionary, hazard statements, and WHMIS labels. Signal words are standardized and assigned to the hazard categories. Only one signal word corresponding to the most severe hazard class should be used on a label. Some hazard categories on a lower level do not use signal words. Let's take a look at what these signal words are. There are only two signal words used and assigned to the hazard categories: danger and warning. Danger represents a higher risk, whereas warning is less severe. When you see a danger on a label, it's one of the first indications that the product is extremely hazardous, and you should use caution. Always read and follow the instructions on the label. Don't let a warning signal word fool you. This product is still hazardous. Always read and follow the label's instructions prior to use. Let's take a look at our hazard and precautionary statements. Hazard statements are used in alphanumeric code for reference purposes. Suppliers use the hazard statements to communicate the related hazards of the product when creating labels and SDSs. This information is important to you because a hazard statement is identifying the hazard you will be exposed to when using a product. In conjunction with a signal word, this information is critical in understanding the risk posed by products. The hazard statements are identified in the 3 hazard categories: physical hazards, health, and environmental hazards. We will review a workplace label to show the wording and placement of the hazard statement. A precautionary statement is a phrase and/or pictogram that describes the measurements you need to use to prevent or minimize the risks associated to the exposure of a hazardous product. Just like hazard statements, precautionary statements use alphanumeric code for reference purposes when the label and SDS is created. There are 4 types of precautionary statements, and each will relay critical information to keep yourself safe. General statements like, "This product should be kept away from children," "Read the label before use," or "Keep product label on hand when seeking medical advice," will also be listed here. The first type is prevention. Do not breathe or inhale vapors, gases, or fumes. How do you prevent exposure? The second type is response. What do you do if you're exposed to the product? If you inhaled or ingested it? Should you call a poison control center or induce vomiting? Will you be okay? The next is storage. How do you safely store this product? Should it be kept out of sunlight? And finally, disposal. Is there a specific way to safely dispose of this product? Does it need to go to a specific landfill? Knowing what to do if you're exposed to a hazardous product is key to keeping yourself safe. Now let's take a look at WHMIS labels. Labels are used to communicate hazards and precautionary measures to users of the product. There are 2 main types of WHMIS labels: supplier labels, which are placed on the container by the manufacturer or supplier; workplace labels, which are placed on the container by the employer or worker where needed at the workplace. The label contains some important information. Let's take a look at what's required on a label. The supplier must include the following information: product identifier, the brand name, chemical name, common name, generic name or trade name of the hazardous product; initial supplier identifier, the name, address, and telephone number of either its Canadian manufacturer or the Canadian importer; pictograms, a hazard symbol with a red square set on one of its points; signal word, a word used to alert the reader to a potential hazard and to indicate the severity of the hazard; hazard statement, standardized phrases which describe the nature of the hazard posed by the hazardous product; precautionary statement, standardized phrase that describes measures to be taken to minimize or prevent adverse effects resulting from exposure to a hazardous product or resulting from improper handling or storage of a hazardous product. Supplemental label information. Some supplemental label information is required based on the classification of the product. For example, the label for a mixture containing ingredients with unknown toxicity in amounts higher than or equal to 1% must include a statement indicating the percent of the ingredient or ingredients with unknown toxicity. Labels may also include supplementary information about precautionary actions, hazards not yet included in the GHS, physical state, or route of exposure. This information must not contradict or detract from the standardized information. This is a workplace label, and it's your first line of defense when working with a hazardous material. Always look for the label and review it before using the product. In the example, you can see number 1 shows the name of the product, N-propyl alcohol. Number 2 is the signal word. In this case, it's danger, which tells you the product has higher hazards. Number 3 on the label shows the hazard statement. In this example, it is highly flammable liquid and vapor, which is the physical hazard. Then it says causes serious eye damage and may cause drowsiness and dizziness, which are the health hazard. There are no environmental hazards stated for this product. Number 4 is the precautionary statement. Read the precautionary statement in the example. Number 5 is the supplier identification, which includes their name, address, and telephone number. Number 6 is the pictograms that warn you of the specific hazards of the product. Always review this information in detail before using the product. It could save your life. A workplace label will require the following information. 1. Product name, matching the SDS product name. 2. Safe handling precautions, may include pictograms or other supplier label information. 3. A reference to the SDS if available. There are 2 situations when a workplace label is not necessary. When a hazardous product is poured into a container and is going to be used immediately, or under the control of a person who decanted it. For example, when the person who poured the product into another container will be the only person who will use it, and the product will be used during one shift, a full workplace label may not be required. However, the container must still be identified with the product identifier name. Let's pause once again and review what we've learned. Module 6. Safety Data Sheets, or SDSs. While the WHMIS label provides important information on the hazardous product on the spot, the SDS contains additional details which are important for handling emergencies, cleanups, or ensuring proper designation of controls for the safe handling, use, and storage of the hazardous product. Under GHS, Material Safety Data Sheets, or MSDSs, will now be called Safety Data Sheets, or SDS. Although the same chemical safety information will be present, WHMIS GHS Safety Data Sheets, or SDSs, contain 16 sections of information. These 16 sections are standardized and always follow the same format. The SDS sections are 1. Identification. 2. Hazard identification. 3. Composition information on ingredients. 4. First aid measures. 5. Firefighting measures. 6. Accidental release measures. 7. Handling and storage. 8. Exposure controls and personal protection. 9. Physical and chemical properties. 10. Stability and reactivity. 11. Toxicological information. 12. Ecological information. 13. Disposal considerations. 14. Transportation information. 15. Regulatory information. And 16. Other information. Let's take a closer look. Section 1 is the product identification. This includes the product identifier. The name must be exactly the same as the label. It also includes product use. This is important information for the user, as it specifies the intended use of the hazardous product by the supplier. Using the product for any other purpose poses a risk to the user. For example, a solvent used for degassing tanks may pose an explosion risk to workers if used as a cleaning agent due to the tendency for the product to evaporate easily into the air and be ignited. Think about the risk of mixing bleach and ammonia. You'll create chlorine gas. So always remember, this information can be critical for you. Only use the product as described here. Section 2 is for hazard identification. This is where the hazard and precautionary statements, pictograms, and other hazard information will be found. When you're completing your pre-job hazard assessment, or before working with the product, it is very important to read this section. This section also covers the PPE required for working around or with the product. It tells you the likely routes for exposure and the symptoms if there has been exposure. This is the section that answers the first of the 4 questions we asked in the beginning of the course. How do I protect myself? Review the product labels and read the SDS to understand the hazards and controls you need in place to protect yourself. Section 3 is the composition and information on ingredients. This is where the chemical identity and concentration of ingredients will be found. This will allow the user to see the percentage of controlled ingredients within the hazardous product itself. With this information, you can determine exposure levels that are necessary to protect yourself from the hazards. Section 4 is first aid measures. This part of the SDS sheet is critical. Safe evacuation and immediate first aid treatment information will be identified here. The information here must be identical to what's on the label. Knowing what to do in an emergency is imperative in any situation. Trying to find this information after something has happened is like trying to read a book during a hurricane. All employees should be familiar with where to find first aid equipment and how to use it in the workplace. Review of the SDS prior to work should include verification that the required first aid equipment is available or emergency response capabilities are readily available. Section 5. Firefighting measures. We don't use water to extinguish a grease fire, and knowing what type of fire extinguisher to use for a flammable hazardous product is part of your emergency response. This section of the SDS will identify the means of fire suppression and provide the exact type of fire suppression system required for the hazardous product, so you can have it on hand in case something goes wrong. Make sure you have the right equipment on your site for the materials you're using. Section 6 is accidental release measures. Here's where you'll find important information on the procedures to be followed in the event of a spill or release of a hazardous product, the protective equipment the emergency workers must wear, how to neutralize or absorb the product, and any other particular concerns to be aware of will be identified. Section 7. Handling and storage. This subsection will provide information on special handling procedures and equipment for the hazardous product. The information contained here must also be the same as on the label. The storage requirements will also be identified. For example, if the hazardous product requires a specific temperature, be separated from other products or be kept away from ignition sources. Section 8. Exposure controls and personal protection. This is another critical piece of information. Do you need to wear a respirator when using the hazardous product in an enclosed space because it can cause you to lose consciousness if you breathe it for too long? This is where you will find the occupational exposure limits for the hazardous product. These are called the TLV, or threshold limit values, and will include the 8-hour exposure limit, 15-minute exposure limit, and the ceiling limit for the product. Any additional personal protective equipment you need to wear when using the hazardous product will be identified here in detail. Section 9. Physical and chemical properties. Man, this section is quite detailed. Here you will find the specific physical and chemical properties of the hazardous product, such as its physical state. Is it a gas, solid, or liquid? Its odor and appearance. Is it sharp and sweet-smelling? Is the product greasy or in a granular state? Its odor threshold. What is the lowest airborne concentration of the product before you can smell it? This is identified in ppm, or parts per million. Think of H2S. By being able to smell it, are you already at risk? Its vapor pressure. Can this product form vapors that can ignite? Its vapor density. Is the gas heavier or lighter than air? Will it settle in low-lying areas? You'll also find information like its evaporation rate, boiling and freezing points, as well as its pH level. Specific information on its flammability, flash point and flammable limits in the air will also be listed here. All of this information is crucial in developing specific procedures in handling the hazardous product. Section 10. Stability and reactivity. If there is potential for a hazardous product to be developed during the process of burning, that information would be found here. Its explosion data and chemical stability will be identified here as well. Its incompatibility with other products. Remember when we talked about bleach and ammonia? Its reactivity to other products will also be listed here. What happens to the hazardous product when it ages or is heated over time? These are important factors to consider when using and storing a hazardous product. Section 11 is the toxicological information. This part of the SDS will identify the potential routes of entry into your body when exposed to the hazardous product, such as the product being accidentally injected. What happens if you ingest it? Or is it safe if it gets on your skin? What happens if you inhale the fumes? Injection, ingestion, absorption, and inhalation are the 4 routes of entry into your body. Knowing what's hazardous and what isn't will aid you in making sure you take the proper precautions. The lethal dose and concentration of the hazardous product will be identified here, as well as the effects of acute and chronic exposure. Section 12. Ecological information. This is where information on the hazardous product's effects on things like the ecosystem and organisms would be found. Imagine pesticides in fish. Its ability to contaminate the soil will also be identified here. Knowing the importance of preventing a hazardous product from coming into contact with water bodies or the ground is part of how we protect the environment around us. Disposal considerations. Does the hazardous product require specialized waste containers or a specific disposal location? is there an agency to contact regarding the disposal requirements for the product? The specific requirements for waste disposal will be found here. Section 14 is the transport information. The proper shipping name is found in this area as well as the product class. The United Nations number or UN number for the product will be found here as well. This 4-digit number is used for transportation purposes and reference to TDG, or Transportation of Dangerous Goods Information. The product class will also be identified on the TDG placard. Section 15. Regulatory Information. This is a listing of relevant legislation that applies to the hazardous product. It may include health, safety, and environmental legislation references and transportation information. These are regulated by the provincial and federal governing bodies. Section 16 is the last part of the SDS sheet and is for other information. This is the part of the SDS sheet that will contain any additional information required for the hazardous product. Now we've reviewed how important the SDS sheet is when using a hazardous product. Along with the label, the SDS sheet will provide you with the detailed information on how to keep yourself and others safe when using, handling, storing, or transporting a hazardous product. This will be our last review before we complete the course today. Congratulations! You've completed your WHMIS 2015 GHS training. I hope you'll now feel more confident with the WHMIS system. You now have the knowledge and training to better understand how to properly deal with hazardous products in your workplace. Now be safe out there. Cal signing off. Thank you for your time today.